I want to tell you about the afternoon I went looking for a dead man in a Victorian cemetery and got completely and happily lost. It was a late October day back in 2021. I'd come to London for the very first time to spend some quality time with my husband Billy, who was working on a film there. I had the day to myself, and I decided to see if I could find a man. A dead man. I hopped on the tube and made my way to Brompton Cemetery in the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea. If you've never been, and you should go, it earns its reputation. It's one of the great Victorian garden cemeteries. Ornate family crypts, overgrown pathways, the kind of place that feels like it was designed by someone who understood that death should have good bones. I was certainly dressed for the occasion. Long black wool topcoat, heavy enough to mean it. A felt fedora tilted at what I considered a rakish angle. I had in my head cast myself as the Gothic hero of my own Hammer film, drifting elegantly among the monuments, leaves flying before me in the brisk autumn breeze, the warm October sunshine doing exactly what warm October sunshine is supposed to do in a Victorian cemetery. It was, in short, completely perfect. And I was completely lost. I had a name and a vague sense of direction and approximately no idea where I was going. I wandered. I consulted my phone. I wandered some more. I followed what I generously describe as a path, overgrown, half swallowed by the kind of vegetation that clearly hadn't been troubled by a gardener in some years. And I kept walking. And then I found him. A modest stone, quieter than I expected for a man of such spectacular immodesty in life. I stood there in my ridiculous coat with my ridiculous hat, and I looked at the name and I felt, not grief exactly, not reverence in any churchy sense, something warmer than that, something closer to affection. The kind of feeling you have for someone you never met but feel you've always known. I said out loud, to no one in particular, in a Victorian cemetery on a Wednesday afternoon in October, "God bless you, you old queen." His name was Ernest Thesiger. He was an actor, an embroiderer, a wit, a veteran of the psalm, and one of the most flagrantly, unapologetically queer human beings ever to appear in a Hollywood film. He's probably best known for his portrayal of Dr. Septimus Pretorius in James Whale's 1935 masterpiece, Bride of Frankenstein. And he is the reason I was standing in that cemetery in that coat on that afternoon. I've known other men like him, witty, perverse, flagrant, magnificent. Men who walk through the world completely on their own terms and never once apologized for it. I've loved men like that. He was a patron saint of every campy old queen I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and I wanted to pay my respects. My name is Baz Bishop, and this is Baz to the Bone. And today we're going to talk about the most explicitly queer film Universal Pictures ever deemed to release. A perfect film directed by a gay man about outsiders and the bodies that don't belong. But first, who was this enigmatic man? And why does he hold such a fascination for me? Bride of Frankenstein is a 1935 Universal horror film. It is the direct sequel to James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein, and it is better than the original in almost every respect. Which is not a knock on the original. Frankenstein is truly a great film. Bride is just greater. The plot, briefly for those who need it, Henry Frankenstein has survived the events of the first film, abandoned his experiments, and is attempting, with limited conviction, to live a normal life. He has a fiancée. He has a house. He has the general posture of a man who has decided to stop playing God and means it this time, right up until the moment he doesn't. Then Dr. Pretorius arrives. A former mentor, a rival, a man who's been conducting his own experiments in secret and has thought about creations that make Frankenstein's work look positively conservative. Pretorius doesn't want to debate the ethics. He wants them to work together. He wants them to make a woman. What follows is one of the most beautifully strange films Hollywood produced in the 1930s. It has a prologue featuring Mary Shelley herself, played by Elsa Lanchester, who also plays the bride. It has miniature people living in glass jars. It has Boris Karloff's monster learning to speak, finding friendship, losing it. It has a blind hermit who weeps when the monster leaves because the monster was the only company he had. And it has one of the greatest entrances in the history of cinema. Elsa Lanchester, hair wrapped in lightning bolt streaks, hissing like a cat at the creature who she was made for. 5 minutes on screen, 90 years in our head. Now I want to make an argument. Everyone talks about this film as if the title refers to Elsa Lanchester's creature, the woman Frankenstein and Pretorius build in the laboratory. And yes, technically, literally, she is the Bride of Frankenstein. She is right there in the title. But I want to suggest to you that the real Bride of Frankenstein, the figure the film is actually about, is Dr. Pretorius. Think about that. Think about what he does in the film. He arrives uninvited. He seduces Frankenstein away from his domestic life, his fiancée, his hard-won attempts at normalcy. He pulls him back into the laboratory. He needs Frankenstein specifically. Not any scientist, not anyone else. He needs to be joined with him in the act of creation. That is a courtship. That is seduction. That is a marriage being proposed, not in a church, not with rings, but in a laboratory at midnight over a glass of gin and a jar containing a tiny archbishop. Dr. Pretorius is the Bride of Frankenstein. The film knows it. James Whale knew it. Ernest Thesiger certainly knew it. And James Whale, the man who made the film, knew exactly what he was doing, because James Whale was a gay man working in Hollywood in 1935, and Bride of Frankenstein is a film he made when Universal gave him complete creative control and apparently forgot to ask what he was going to do with it. Let me tell you what Bride of Frankenstein is actually doing, because it's doing several things at once and doing all of them well. And most people who dismiss it as a monster movie are missing about 70% of the film. On the surface, yes, monster movie. Sequel to a hit. Designed to make money. Universal had a franchise, and they knew it. That's the commercial reality, and there's no shame in it. But James Whale was not interested in making the same film twice. And he was not interested in pretending to be something he wasn't. And both of those things are all over Bride of Frankenstein, if you know how to look. Let's start with the monster. In Bride of Frankenstein, the monster is not the threat. He is the subject. He wants to live. He wants connection. He learns to speak, haltingly, movingly. And the first thing he learns to say are friend, alone, and good. That is not an accident. Those 3 words are the entire emotional architecture of the film in miniature. He finds a blind hermit living alone in the forest who accepts him without seeing him. And Whale shoots those scenes like a pastoral ideal. Warm light, simple domestic pleasure, 2 outcasts sharing bread and wine and music. It is the happiest the monster is in the entire film. It is possibly the most tender sequence in the Universal horror catalog. Then the village finds them and burns it down. Because the village always burns it down. That is not a monster movie. That is a film about what happens when the world refuses to let something exist because it doesn't fit the available categories. That is a film about the cost of being visibly, undeniably other in a world that has decided other is dangerous. Whale understood that personally. We'll get to that in a moment. The prologue is worth pausing on because it's doing something formally strange and completely brilliant. The film opens not in 1935, but in 1816, in the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva, during a stormy night where Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron are all gathered. And Mary Shelley, played by Elsa Lanchester in a white gown, luminously and slightly mischievous, tells her companions that the story of Frankenstein is not finished. It's a framed narrative. It's Mary Shelley giving herself permission to continue her own story. And Elsa Lanchester plays her with a particular quality: intelligent, composed, faintly amused by the men around her. Then the film ends and Lanchester comes back as the bride, wild-haired, newly conscious, magnificent. The same actress, two women, one who controls the narrative, one who is created by it. We'll put that in there deliberately. I'm certain of it. The film also has, and I want to make sure we give it its due, some of the finest production design Universal ever committed to celluloid. The laboratory sequence in the final act is extraordinary. John J. Mescal's cinematography, Franz Waxman's score, which manages to be simultaneously menacing and campy and genuinely moving. The miniature people in Pretorius's jars, which are absurd and wonderful and played completely straight. This is a film made by people at the top of their craft who were also clearly having an enormous amount of fun. And presiding over all of it, the director, James Whale, who knew exactly what kind of film he was making and made it anyway. Which brings us to the man himself. James Whale was born in 1889 in Dudley, in the Black Country of England. The sixth of 7 children. A working-class family. No money, no connections, no obvious route into the arts. He got there anyway. He worked his way into theater, first as an actor, then as a director, and by the late 1920s he had made it to Broadway. Hollywood soon followed. His 1930 film Journey's End, adapted from the celebrated stage play about the First World War, established him as a serious director with a genuine visual intelligence. Universal Studios took notice. Then came Frankenstein in 1931. Then The Old Dark House in 1932, which happened to feature Ernest Thesiger playing the magnificently unsettling character of Horace Femme. Then The Invisible Man in 1933, and finally Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. 4 films in 5 years, each one formally accomplished, each one stranger and more personal than the last, each one pushing further against the edges of what a Hollywood studio film was supposed to be at the time. Oh, and James Whale was gay. Openly, unapologetically, and by the standards of 1930s Hollywood, spectacularly gay. He lived with his partner David Lewis for years. He didn't hide it. He didn't perform heterosexuality for the cameras or the press. He simply was what he was, and declined to discuss it as though it were a problem. In 1930s Hollywood, this was not a safe or comfortable position. The industry ran on appearances. Contracts had morality clauses. Studios managed their talent's public image with the kind of obsessive control that would make a modern PR firm weep with envy. And Whale just didn't play along. He was who he was. He made the films he wanted to make, and for a few extraordinary years, Universal let him. Why? Because he made them money. That is always why. But here's what's interesting about Whale's position at Universal. He had genuine creative authority in a way that very few directors of that era did. He cast his own films. He controlled his own sets. He brought in people he wanted, including repeatedly Ernest Thesiger, who was his friend, who shared his sensibilities, and who understood without being told what kind of film they were making together. Bride of Frankenstein is the fullest expression of what James Whale could do when left largely to his own devices. It is camp, and it is serious, it is funny, and it is genuinely moving. It is a horror film that is also, if you're paying attention, a sustained meditation on what it costs to be visibly, irrevocably other in a world built for someone else. Will knew that cost. He had been paying it his whole life. His later years were not kind. After Bride, Universal began pushing him toward more commercial projects. He resisted. The relationship soured, and by the early 1940s, he was effectively finished in Hollywood. Too difficult, too expensive, too unwilling to compromise. He retired to his home in Pacific Palisades, painted, entertained, and lived quietly with the man he loved. He died in 1957. He was found in his swimming pool. The official verdict was accidental drowning. A note was later discovered, suppressed at the time by his partner with the best of intentions, that made clear it was not an accident. He was 67 years old. He was in poor health. He had made his decision. Bill Condon made a film about Whale's final days in 1998, Gods and Monsters. Ian McKellen plays Whale, and it's a beautiful, melancholy film, and I recommend it without reservation. But what I want you to take from it, and from Whale's life, is not the sadness of the ending. I want you to take the films. Because what James Whale did in Bride of Frankenstein, what he smuggled into a Universal monster movie in 1935, was a fully realized queer vision. Outsiders as subjects, not threats. The domestic as cage. Creation as the truest form of desire. And at the center of it all, one extraordinarily impossible figure, Dr. Pretorius. Let me tell you about Dr. Pretorius. He arrives on Henry Frankenstein's wedding night. Not the next morning, not a week later when the happy couple have settled in. The wedding night. Henry is barely through the door of his own home, his new wife beside him, his respectable life finally formally begun, and Pretorius is already there, waiting, uninvited, unannounced, completely untroubled by either of those facts. And look at what he's wearing. A long Puritan coat, the garment of a man of severe moral conviction. A collar fit for a Catholic priest, and on his head a small hemispherical cap, a cap that signified intellectual rather than manual pursuit. Pretorius has assembled himself from the entire hierarchy of men who believed they had the divine right to meddle with creation. Puritan, Catholic, papal, scholarly, he is wearing the full chain of command simultaneously, and without a trace of irony. He's thin as a blade, he has eyebrows that appear to have developed independent opinions, and he carries himself with the serene confidence of a man who has never once wondered whether he was welcome. He is not welcome, but he comes anyway. He pours himself a drink without being offered one, and then, unhurriedly, utterly at ease, he begins the seduction. He produces a set of glass jars. Inside each one, a homunculus. Tiny people grown from cultures. A king, a queen, a bishop, a devil, a ballerina, even a mermaid, all presented with the quiet satisfaction of a man showing off his prize roses. He informs Frankenstein that he was expelled from his university for going too far. He says this the way other people say they once stayed up past midnight. And then he makes his proposal. They will work together. They will make a woman. It will be, he suggests, a new world of gods and monsters. Ernest Thesiger plays this man, and I want to be precise about what Ernest Thesiger is doing in this performance because it's not a small thing. He is not playing a villain who happens to be eccentric. He is playing a man who is entirely, serenely, magnificently himself in every scene he occupies. There's no performance of normalcy. There's no concession to what the room expects of him. He walks into every scene and immediately, effortlessly, makes it his. Pretorius is coded queer in every frame he appears in. The campiness is not incidental. It is the point. Whale and Thesiger, two gay men working in Hollywood in 1935, put a flagrantly queer character at the center of a very major studio film and played him not as pathetic, not as predatory, not as a warning. They played him as the most alive person in the room. That was an act of considerable nerve. Now, I said earlier that Dr. Pretorius is the real Bride of Frankenstein. Let me make that argument properly. Look at what Pretorius wants. Not in the abstract, specifically in the film. He wants Henry Frankenstein. Not his laboratory, not his techniques, not his notes. He wants him. He needs Frankenstein specifically because Frankenstein is the only other person in the world who understands what he understands and can do what he can do. He wants a partner. He wants a collaborator. He wants to make something together that neither of them could make alone. That is desire. That is courtship. That is, if you're willing to look at it directly, love of a particular kind. And Frankenstein resists. He has a fiancée. He has his respectable life. He has made his decision about who he is going to be. But Pretorius is patient. Pretorius is persistent. And eventually, after pressure, after manipulation, after arranging for the monster to kidnap his fiancée, Frankenstein comes back to the laboratory. He always comes back to the laboratory. The manipulation matters here, and I'm not romanticizing it. Pretorius uses coercion. He is a villain, but he is a villain in the way that most compelling villains always are. Not because he wants to destroy, but because he wants something so badly that he was willing to do whatever it takes to get it. What he wants is Victor Frankenstein. What he wants is the work. What he wants is not to be alone in what he is. I've known a lot of men like that. Not the coercion part. I want to be clear about that. But the hunger. The absolute refusal to accept that what they were was something to be hidden or diminished or apologized for. The men I've known who walked into rooms the way Pretorius walks into rooms. Already at home, already themselves, completely unbothered by whether the room agreed. The witty ones, the perverse ones, the flagrant ones, the ones who made life more interesting just by being in it. Ernest Thesiger was like that. By every account, and there are wonderful accounts, he was exactly like that. He was an embroiderer of extraordinary skill. He published a book on needlepoint in 1941 called Adventures in Embroidery. He did needlepoint in the trenches during the First World War, and reportedly said that the worst thing about the war was the mud, because it got into his embroidery silks. That is a man completely at one with himself in circumstances designed to unmake you. He appeared in The Old Dark House in 1932, Whale's earlier film, as Horace Femme, the skeletal, deeply strange head of a family that makes the Addams Family look well-adjusted. If you have not seen The Old Dark House, consider this your instruction. Thesiger is extraordinary in it. Femme is a different register to Pretorius, more unsettling, less openly camp, but the same intelligence is there. The same refusal to be ordinary. I want to talk about the bride now. Not Pretorius, not Whale, not the monster, but the bride herself. Because she deserves her own movement, and she almost never gets one. Here are the facts. Elsa Lanchester appears in Bride of Frankenstein twice. First as Mary Shelley in the prologue, composed, luminous, faintly amused, controlling the narrative with the quiet authority of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. Then, in the final act, as the bride, a creature assembled from the dead, brought to life by electricity, presented to the world in bandages like a mummy being unwrapped for a ceremony she didn't agree to attend. She is in the film for approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 90 years in the cultural memory. There is no other character in the Universal Horror catalog who has achieved that ratio of screen time to impact. Not Dracula, not the Wolfman, not the Mummy. The bride appears for 5 minutes, and she has never left. Let me tell you why. When the bride is brought to life, the men in the room, Frankenstein, Pretorius, the creature, are all waiting for her response. They have made her. They have a plan for her. The monster in particular has been promised a companion. Someone made just for him. Someone who will understand. The bride looks around the room. She looks at the monster, and she recoils. She hisses at him. A sharp, instinctive, fully embodied rejection. Not confusion, not fear exactly, refusal. She has been conscious for approximately 45 seconds, and she already knows what she does not want. Now, the standard reading of this moment is that it's tragic for the monster, and it is. Boris Karloff plays that rejection with a devastation that is genuinely hard to watch. When the monster says, in his halting, broken way, "She hate me, like others," it is one of the most quietly heartbreaking lines in horror cinema. But I want you to ask you to look at it from the other direction. The bride was created without her consent. She was assembled from dead women's bodies, animated by electricity, and presented, still bandaged, still coming to terms with the fact that she exists at all, to a creature she has never met, for a purpose she never agreed to. The men who made her had a plan for her life before she had drawn her first breath. And her first act, her very first act as a conscious being, is to say no. She doesn't deliberate. She doesn't perform reluctance and then comply. She looks at what is being offered to her and she refuses it. Completely, instinctively, from the very core of whatever self she arrived with. That is not a monster. That is a woman asserting agency in the only way available to her in the only moment she is given to do it. Elsa Lanchester does something extraordinary in those short minutes. She plays the bride coming into consciousness, not as terror, not as submission, not as the grateful recipient of the gift of life. She plays her as a fully formed self, arriving in a world that has already decided what she is for. The hiss is not animal panic. The hiss is opinion. I have enormous respect for that hiss. Women should hiss at men more often. Now, here's the thing that I found most remarkable about the bride. And this is my read, my personal take. I'm not citing scholarship here. But she is the only universal monster who never harmed anyone. Think about that across the catalog. Dracula kills, the Wolfman kills, Frankenstein's monster, sympathetic as he is, kills. The mummy, the creature, even Pretorius, for all his camp magnificence, causes harm. His manipulations get people killed. His ambitions are genuinely dangerous. The bride just hisses. That's it. That's the full extent of her threat to the world. And what happens to her? The monster, understanding that she will never accept him, that there is no place in this world for either of them, pulls the lever. The laboratory explodes. The bride dies. She's been alive for perhaps 5 minutes. She has harmed no one. She said no to one thing once, and she is destroyed for it. James Whale put that in his film in 1935. A woman created without consent, given no choice about her existence or her purpose, who asserts her own will in the only moment she has, and is killed for it. Not by a villain, but by the story itself. I don't think that was an accident. Whale knew what it was to have the world decide what you were before you had a chance to say. He knew what it cost to refuse the available categories. He put it in the film because it was true, and because in 1935 a horror film was one of the few places you could put true things and have them reach an audience. Elsa Lanchester understood all of this. She plays both women in the film, the one who controls the narrative and the one who is destroyed by it, with a complete intelligence and complete commitment. Mary Shelley and the Bride are the same actress, the same face, separated by a prologue and a century of fictional time. That doubling is not incidental. It is the argument. 5 minutes. 90 years. She's earned every one of them. I want to come back to the monster now, because we've talked about Pretorius and we've talked about the Bride, and both of them are extraordinary, but the monster is the film's heart. He's the one we follow. He's the one the camera stays with the longest. He's the one Boris Karloff plays with such unguarded, aching sincerity that you forget repeatedly that you are watching a man in 4 hours' worth of makeup. The monster in Bride of Frankenstein wants 3 things. He wants to live, he wants to be understood, and he wants not to be alone. That's it. That is the full extent of his ambition. He's not trying to conquer anything. He's not trying to destroy anything. He wants what every human being wants. Connection, comprehension, the basic dignity of being seen for what you actually are rather than what you look like. The world will not give him any of it. I want to be specific about the hermit sequence because it's the most important scene in the film and it doesn't get treated that way. The hermit is blind. That detail is not incidental. It's the entire point. He cannot see the monster. He cannot see the bolts, the stitching, the assembled wrongness of the body standing in his doorway. He opens his door to a stranger in need and he takes him in. He feeds him. He teaches him words. He plays music for him. He thanks God, out loud, genuinely, for sending him a friend. And together they are happy. Whale shoots those scenes in a warm, golden light, pastoral, almost tender. 2 men sharing bread and wine and music and company. 2 outcasts who found each other at the end of an overgrown path and decided that was enough. That was everything. The only person in this film who shows the monster genuine love is a man who cannot even see him. Think about what Whale is saying with that. Love requires blindness. Acceptance requires the inability to perceive difference. The world with its eyes open will always reach for a torch. It takes a man without sight to extend a hand. And then the hunters arrive. Not a mob, not a castle siege. Just some men with guns who come across something they don't understand and do what men with guns do when they encounter things they don't understand. The cottage burns, the hermit weeps, the monster flees into the forest. And when he goes, the hermit is alone again. He has lost the only companionship he ever had. Both of them destroyed by the arrival of the ordinary world. That sequence alone would make Bride of Frankenstein worth preserving. Everything else is a bonus. The outsider body is the central subject of this film. Not just the monster's body, assembled from dead men, bolted together, animated by lightning, moving through a world that finds its existence offensive. All of the bodies in this film are wrong by the standards of the world they inhabit. The monster, the bride, Pretorius himself, too thin, too strange, too unapologetically other to pass as ordinary, even if he wanted to, which he manifestly does not want to. None of them belong. All of them insist on existing anyway. That is a queer film. Not because of any single scene or character or line of the dialogue, though all of those things are there, but because the entire moral architecture of the film is built around the dignity of the body that doesn't fit. The right to exist on your own terms. The cost of that existence in a world that hasn't decided to allow it yet. James Whale made that film in 1935, for Universal Pictures, and they released it, and it made a lot of money, and most of the audience went home thinking they'd seen a monster flick. They had, just not the kind they thought. The ending of the film has always stayed with me. The monster pulls the lever, the laboratory collapses. Frankenstein and his new wife escape, back to the domestic life, the respectable life, saved. Pretorius dies in the rubble, the bride dies, and the monster. Everyone who refused the available categories is gone. The man who accepted them walks out into the night with his wife. Wales let that land without comment. He doesn't editorialize. He doesn't soften it. He just shows you what happens, who survives and who doesn't, and leaves you to sit with it. I've sat with it for a long time. The monster's last line in the film is addressed to Dr. Frankenstein before he pulls the lever. He looks at the man who made him, the man who gave him life and then abandoned him and then came back and then failed him. And he says, "We belong dead." It is the saddest line in the Universal horror catalog. A creature who wanted nothing more than to live and be known, who tried every available route towards connection and found every one of them burned or collapsed or recoiling in disgust. He was right to want what he wanted. The wanting was never the problem. The problem was the world. James Whale understood that. Ernest Thesiger understood that. And a scared kid in a Southern Baptist household in Allendale, South Carolina, watching a television set in the dark, he understood that too. I want to go back to Brompton Cemetery for a moment. I told you about the afternoon, the coat, the fabulous hat, the overgrown path, and finding the grave. What I didn't tell you, what I've been holding back for the right moment, is what I was actually thinking about while I was standing there. I was thinking about the men I've lost. A generation of men lost to AIDS. I came out before the pestilence even really had a name. The name it had first was GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, which tells you everything you need to know about how the world was intending to handle it. Not a disease, a classification, a way of saying, this is yours. This belongs to you specifically. This is what you get for being what you are. The press called it the gay plague, the gay cancer. Words chosen not to describe but to locate blame. To make sure everyone understood that whatever this was, it had an address. And that address was us. It became known as AIDS in 1982, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. A name that at least had the decency to describe what it did rather than who it blamed. But by then, the framework was set. The prejudice was already baked in. The misunderstanding was structural and largely intentional, and it cost an uncountable number of lives, including most of the people I loved. I came of age in the American South, gay man, the absolute worst timing in the history of bad timing. The crisis didn't arrive in my life as news or statistics or something happening somewhere else to someone else. It arrived as funerals, as phone calls, as the particular mathematics of a social world that keeps getting smaller and doesn't stop. There's a term, the worried well, the ones who didn't get sick, the ones who tested negative and kept testing negative and watched the people around them disappear anyway. That was me. That is me. Which sounds almost like a relief until you understand what it actually means. That you survived something that took most of the people you loved, and you have been trying to make sense of that arithmetic ever since. I don't have a lot of people my age left. That's not self-pity. It's just the arithmetic of that era. The men I came up with, the men who shaped me, the men who taught me how to be who I am, most of them are gone. The witty ones, the perverse ones, the flagrant ones, the ones who walked into rooms the way Pretorius walks into rooms, the ones who were, every one of them, completely and unapologetically themselves. I've been thinking about those men my entire adult life. I've been thinking about what they gave me, not just the friendship, not just the love, but the permission, the example, the living proof that you could be exactly what you were and refuse to apologize for it and survive, that you could be the most flagrant person in the room and make that a form of dignity rather than a liability. Ernest Thesiger gave me a version of that on a television screen in a film 30 years before I was born. Dr. Pretorius walks into Henry Frankenstein's house on his wedding night, and he is completely, serenely, magnificently himself. And I watched that as a young gay man, growing up in the American South with limited access to models of what a gay man could be. And something inside me went, that's the one. Not the manipulation, not the coercion, the refusal to diminish, the absolute unshakable conviction that he had every right to exist exactly as he was, and that the world's discomfort with that was the world's problem to solve, not his. I have known men like that in my life, real men, flesh and blood, who carried themselves through the world with that same quality, the same serene, magnificent refusal. And the AIDS crisis took most of them. And the ones it didn't take, time has. And I'm standing in a Victorian cemetery in a ridiculous coat on a Wednesday afternoon in October talking to a stone. And I'm so grateful he existed. That a gay man in 1930s Hollywood, Ernest Thesiger, openly camp, completely himself, embroidering in the trenches for the love of God, stood in front of a camera and played that character in that way, in that film, and left it there for people like me to find. The monster's blind hermit thanks God for sending him a friend. I understand that completely. James Whale made a film about outsiders because he was one. Ernest Thesiger played Pretorius the way he played him because he was Pretorius, or close enough that the distance didn't matter. And somewhere in the American South, a kid was finding something in that film that he didn't have a word for yet. Well, he has the words now. This is what horror gave us. Before the language existed, before the community existed, before there were places you could go and people you could find who understood what you were, horror gave us outsiders who insisted on existing, monsters who just wanted to live, villains who were more alive than everyone around them. It gave us permission. It dressed us up in bandages and lightning bolts and a Puritan coat with a Catholic collar and a skull cap. We knew what it meant. We always knew. God bless you, you old queen. I meant every word. Bride of Frankenstein is a perfect film. I don't use that word lightly. Perfect doesn't mean without flaw, because nothing is without flaw. It means that the film is completely, entirely itself, that every element is in service of the same vision, and that James Whale made exactly the film he intended to make, and not one frame less. It is a horror film about outsiders, made by outsiders, for an audience that largely didn't know it was one of them yet. It's a love story between a man and his work, and the collaborator he couldn't do without. It's a tragedy about a creature who wanted nothing more than to live and be known. It is 5 minutes of a woman who said no and paid for it with everything. And it is a record, a document, evidence that in 1935, in Hollywood, at the height of the studio system's control over everything it touched, 2 gay men walked onto a soundstage and made something true. That matters. It's always mattered. It matters more now than it did when I first understood it. I stood at Ernest Thesiger's grave on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and I thanked him for the performance, for the life, for being exactly, flagrantly, magnificently what he was in a world that had very limited tolerance for it. for leaving something behind that people like me could find in the dark, on a TV screen, in a house that went to church on Sunday mornings. And now, a brief word about what's coming next. Episode 4 of Baz to the Bone is called He Made Me Gay. The horror icons who did something to us. It is funny. It is personal. It is the episode I've wanted to make since I understood what this show was. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. Please leave a review if you're so inclined. Tell someone who would get it. The show finds its audience one monster kid at a time. My name is Baz Bishop, and this has been Baz to the Bone. Now tell me something.